thinking about gold. A lot of them were just obsessed about gold.
So they call this the railway built of gold. The White Pass Railroad has actually been greeting passengers since the 1898 Klondike Gold Rush.
So you're actually going to see a river from source to mouth today.
I think that visitors to this particular national park have the advantage and the benefit of walking back in time.
Every morning we recreate the Klondike Gold Rush all over again.
In 1896, gold was discovered along the Klondike River in the Yukon Territory. When word got out, a stampede of fortune seekers headed north. One of the great legacies of the Gold Rush era is the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad, known as the Railway Built of Gold.
The White Pass Railroad has actually been greeting cruise ship passengers since the 1898 Klondike Gold Rush. We've had tracks built right down to the waterfront, and they greeted the stampeders, took them up north, and then right from the very beginning we'd have excursions, scenic excursions up to Lake Bennett and return for cruise ship passengers. And so today it's very, very similar. We have cruise ships coming into port, we back the train right down. Lee Hartson's probably going to have a locomotive on...
Tina Sear is a third-generation railroader with the White Pass and Yukon route.
It started billing itself out as a scenic railway of the world in 1901. People are expecting spectacular scenery. It's one of the steepest narrow gauges in North America. A lot of people have heard all about the Klondike Gold Rush. It's the last operating link that dates right back to the Gold Rush. You're operating on a 100-year-old train in restored parlor cars and sometimes on the steam engine. And so people really get a taste of what it might have been like for the stampeders and get a good sense of history. And when you ride the train, especially on a foggy day, you really start to think, man, we're doing this trip in an hour and a half, and it took those people a month to make 20 different trips up over the pass, carrying their required ton of goods. It was just a whole different world. I think it's hard for people to comprehend, but they can get a sense of it when they're here.
People arrive in Alaska's southeast panhandle much as the Gold Rush stampeders did over 100 years ago, along the water route of the Inside Passage. Today, giant cruise ships drop thousands of visitors a day at Skagway, the gateway to the Gold Rush territory. Skagway has a year-round population of only 800 people. During the summer, more than 800,000 people visit the town. False-fronted buildings and wooden boardwalks, many dating from Gold Rush times, line the downtown historical district. Gift shops, performance halls, and small museums convey the story of Skagway's Gold Rush past and its present-day stampede of tourists.
And ladies and gentlemen, this is Skagway. And this is Broadway. 8 blocks of bliss laid out for your entertainment, friends. Over here on the right, White Pass and Yukon Rotary Snowplow number 1. White Pass Railroad steam snowplow that's used in the springtime to plow some snow off the track for rail fans.
Steve Heitz is a local businessman and entertainer. He enthusiastically combines those talents during his Skagway streetcar tours. The vintage touring automobiles were once used in Yellowstone and other national parks.
On the left, the two-story white frame building with green trim, the notorious Red Onion Saloon and Bordello. Downstairs is the saloon. Upstairs, ladies of the evening, scantily clad, have red lights burning in the window.
There is no place in Alaska like Skagway. Every morning we recreate the Klondike Gold Rush all over again. Steamers come around the point, they tie up to the wharves, people get off, where's the gold, where's the adventure? And they get on board the narrow gauge railroad or a horse and buggy or an antique automobile or a helicopter up onto a glacier. And they reenact their own desire to find that golden experience that in the old days was looking to find wealth. And now is the wealth of experience or the wealth of memories.
On the left, covered with 10,000 pieces of driftwood, the Arctic Brotherhood Hall, Camp Skagway No. 1. This was a social club during the gold rush. Today it's our city museum.
Every year that distance gets greater back to the Klondike. How are we going to be able to know what that was like? Because of places like Skagway, because it's frozen in time. You can hear the ghosts. They're out there just right there on the boardwalk and in the alleys. Klondike is alive and well, and the memory of that will be carried on in Skagway for all time.
The Mascot Saloon, one of 75 watering holes in Skagway at the height of the gold rush. You would have been tripping over saloons walking down the street. No, you cannot buy a beer in there, but the National Park Service will interpret for you what a beer would have tasted like.
The centerpiece of the Skagway Historical District is the 15 buildings of the Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park. It is Alaska's most visited national park.
I think that visitors to this particular national park have the advantage and the benefit of walking back in time.
Linda Cook is the acting superintendent of the National Park Service facility in Skagway.
The Skagway experience is an experience that allows the individual and the visitor to a national historical park to walk down streets and look at buildings and structures and a place that is extremely true to history. You come in off the harbor, you're coming in off the same path that those tens of thousands of gold seekers came 100 years ago. So I think that the visitor can come away with truly an American heritage experience that connects them to those people.
The National Park Service Visitors Center is housed in the original White Pass and Yukon Route Depot. Built in 1898, it was a dominant structure in Gold Rush Skagway. The second-story bay window overlooking Broadway was used by railroad dispatchers in the days when tracks ran down the middle of Main Street. Next door, the modern train station serves as the starting point for today's rail journey. The White Pass Railroad ran for 110 miles from Skagway, Alaska to Whitehorse in Canada's Yukon Territory. Today's railroad operates on only 40 miles of the original route. The 3-hour excursion to the White Pass summit is the most popular trip for cruise ship passengers. Our longer journey takes us to the Gold Rush tent city at Lake Bennett.
Welcome aboard the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad. We are truly going to be following along the footsteps of history this afternoon, because we're going to parallel one of the paths that thousands of stampeders took in search for gold 100 years ago. So that's why you hear the whistles. That means that we are exiting Skagway.
Corey Gertz is an onboard guide who shares insights about the Gold Rush and the railroad.
In all of Alaska. But try to imagine it 100 years ago. Now, at the height of the gold rush, Skagway was truly a lawless place. Well, Skagway's most infamous gangster and conman of the time was a gentleman known as Jefferson Randolph Soapy Smith. Soapy came up to Skagway back in 1897, and he had all sorts of schemes to fleece the money from the newly wealthy prospectors. So we're coming up to the gravesite of Soapy Smith. It's milepost 2.5 from your rail maps, the Gold Rush Cemetery. You'll see this on the right side of the train.
The story of how Soapy Smith came to be buried in the Gold Rush Cemetery is one of Skagway's tallest tales.
He was undoubtedly one of the smoothest operators in American Western history. At the height of his power, Soapy controlled the entire town.
Smith was killed by Frank Reed, the city engineer, during a gunfight on July 8, 1898. Reed also died in the exchange.
The whole town comes out for this giant funeral service for Frank Reed, build a big monument for him. And it says very simply, he gave his life for the honor of Skagway. They bury Soapy out at the edge of the cemetery where he won't infringe on the eternity of others. And over the years, Soapy, of course, is the one that the pathway has beaten to first, at the edge of the Gold Rush Cemetery.
For much of the route to the summit, the tracks parallel the Skagway River. Silt from nearby glaciers give it a gray, murky appearance. A piece of rail history at the Denver stop serves a new purpose for today's rail passengers.
Okay, here we go. See you tomorrow. Have a good one.
After exploring the Alaskan wilderness, hikers can rent the old caboose for overnight stays. A hiking trail leads away from the tracks to Denver Glacier, some 2,500 feet higher in elevation. The White Pass Railroad is only one of 20 engineering feats in the world to be named an International Historic Civil Engineering Landmark, an honor it shares with the Eiffel Tower, Panama Canal, and Statue of Liberty. The cliff-hanging climb to the summit includes grades as steep as 3.9 degrees, making this one of the steepest railroads in North America.
And you're going to want to get your cameras ready, because in just a moment we're coming up to a great clearing in the trees where we can view Skagway from around 7 miles away. See where the Skagway River dumps in the Pacific Ocean, right at the end of the Inside Passage, an area called the Lynn Canal.
As the train enters the narrowest part of the canyon, the tracks wrap around the mountain on a shelf of granite that was literally blasted out of the cliff. Steep rocky walls bound the tracks on one side. On the other side, the canyon drops off more than 500 feet to the Skagway River. Passengers begin to appreciate both the scenic beauty and the engineering achievement of this historic route.
So they call this the Railway Built of Gold. And I think that's a pretty appropriate title for our railroad. It was built by and for the Klondike Gold Rush stampeders. They found the gold in August of 1896. Well, as you can imagine, virtually overnight the rush was on. Historians are quoted as saying, "The time was right for the lunacy that followed."
The country was just sort of in the midst of depression, and the word was that you could walk down the streets of Dawson and you pick up dole. So everybody decided to head north, head for the Klondike. They estimate at least 1 million people were thinking about going to the Klondike. 100,000 actually left, and about 30 to 40,000 staggered into Dawson city about a year later or so.
Carl Gerke is a cultural resource specialist with the National Park Service. He studies the impact of the gold rush on the boomtowns of Skagway and Dyea.
Well, this is one of a number of pilings that are the last remnants of the Great Long Wharf here in Dyea. The original wharf stretched about 2 miles out into the waterfront there, and it was intended to provide an avenue of competition with Skagway. There were several routes to the Klondike. Most of the people went up the Inside Passage to Skagway or Dyea. You had the trail leading out of Skagway, and that was called the White Pass Trail. Dyea was the other community, and the trail leading out of Dyea was the Chilkoot Trail. I like what one old-timer said, one trail is hell and the other trail is damnation. You know, take your pick. They're both bad. They were both horrendous. Most of them did it in the dead of winter. It was a madhouse. It was crazy. They were thinking about gold. A lot of them were just obsessed about gold. And it was also sort of a mob mentality. I mean, everybody was going. You felt you just had to be just a little bit faster than the next person.
The Chilkoot Trail was shorter, but steeper. The White Pass Trail was longer, with a more gradual ascent. There was a fierce competition between the two boomtowns to attract stampeders.
I think it was really a competition to the death, a fight to the death. The reason for Skagway's survival was the railroad. Certainly by the time the railroad reached the summit in February 1899, it was all over for the Chilkoot. And Dyea was quickly disappeared after that.
What was most surprising to me was the relatively few people who actually were able to find gold and made some money. It was probably more than the lure of gold. It might have been adventure, chance to get away, chance to go to a new frontier. It must have been very exciting, but also very difficult times.
We heard about the one woman who climbed the trail with her sewing machine and set up shop and made her money sewing for people, sewing tents and whatever, and the thought of even getting up here without anything on my back is unbelievable.
High above the tracks, runoff from Goat Lake feeds a waterfall that cascades 1,800 feet down the mountain and under the tracks. One of many waterfalls along the route, Pitchfork Falls gets its name from the way the waterfall splits into several forks below the tracks. Black Cross Rock marks one of the most solemn spots along the route. On August 8, 1898, a 100-ton granite slab came loose during a blasting accident, crushing 2 railroad workers. The black wooden cross marks their final resting place and serves as a memorial to the more than 30 men who lost their lives building the railroad.
It took them 2 years to build the railroad. Everything that was used on the railroad, for the ties, the rails, the rolling stock, dynamite, people, all had to be imported.
Carl Mulvihill is a third-generation White Pass railroader. His grandfather came north in 1900 as a train dispatcher, and his father worked for the railroad for 40 years.
I don't need to go down and...
Now retired, Carl is an unofficial historian for the White Pass and Yukon route.
up by the train loads practically, or they blasted along the cliffs. It was quite dangerous. The hardest part was the actual drilling. When you're working on a cliff, you're hanging by ropes. This is very dramatic photographs of these people hanging by ropes, holding this rock drill. It wasn't an easy job. It was quite an engineering marvel at that time. Certainly very scenic, very spectacular. We get a lot of people down who've traveled around the world, and they've always described this as the prettiest portion of all the world travels.
No gold was ever found near Skagway or along the route of the train. The Klondike goldfields were another 500 miles to the north. Frustrated stampeders made up the bulk of the workforce that built the railroad, often abandoning construction on the rumor of a new gold strike.
Oh, in just a moment, we're going to come up to Glacier Station. This is milepost 14 from your rail maps. Here at Glacier Station is one of our popular flag stops. We still run a flag stop train where we allow hikers off. They can hike all day and then flag a train back into town. Glacier Station is the trailhead to the popular Lawton Glacier. It's about a 4-mile hike up to the glacier.
Interesting feature here. This little waterfall carving its way out.
One of the most exciting ways to explore the Lawton Trail and Glacier is a trip that combines a helicopter tour, a hiking trip, and a ride back to town on the train.
If you look around at these intermediary peaks, about 3,000 to 4,000 feet, they're all rounded. Well, they were sheared over by ice during the last ice age. So that big ice sheet sat there, but it didn't quite touch these higher peaks at 6,000 or 7,000. The Sawtooth's off to our right, and these mountains off to our left towards the White Pass. All the glaciers you see around here are in a state of recession as well. What that means is that they're still producing ice, but at the same time, the melt occurring is outpacing the ice production. So they're sort of taking one step forward and 2 steps backwards. You see a lot of evidence of that. Directly beneath us right about now is the White Pass Railroad. It's going to run up the right side of this valley. Land us here right by the railroad tracks. And here you guys can pick up the trail.
Hello folks, I'm Tim. Welcome to the Lawton Glacier Trailhead. I will be your guide today. Even though we're just a mere 14 miles from Skagway, we are definitely out in the sticks. The only bit of civilization right here is this little ribbon of a railroad. So you'll notice as we head in, you will hit wilderness right away. The boundary peaks are right here, and these are called the Sawtooths.
Why the sawtooth? What makes?
It's just the jaggedness of it. A lot of the peaks up here, you know, like these peaks are called the boundary peaks, and these are called the sawtooths, but most of them don't have names. This is the Skagway River. We're actually going to be going to the headwaters of the Skagway River today when we look at the Lawton Glacier. So you're actually going to see a river basically from source to mouth today. So we'll get fairly intimate with this river as we go. The river right now is fairly low. If we have 4 or 5 days of hot weather, this river will come up 7 feet. And you won't physically be able to come out here. Take a break. There's snacks in your pack if you want some. If you guys want to take some pictures out here, we'd definitely like to do that for you. Bears are common up here, both black and brown. We need to be aware of them. You know, you can see, I mean, some pretty decent claw patterns here. Black bears around here are in the 200-pound range. Yeah, it was probably leaning a little bit by the time he got up there. It's not a big tree. Whew. Getting slippery. It's kind of our turnaround. We're going to just take about a 15-minute break. Spot back here, isn't it? It's going to be a little slippery going out on some of the roots and stuff, so just be real careful. All right.
Okay, you guys, 5 more steps.
After a day in the rainforest, our helihikers enjoy the ride back to Skagway in the comfort of the train. As the train makes its way to the summit, the tracks temporarily break away from the original White Pass Trail, beginning a 3-mile loop needed to gradually gain elevation. The train curves around a U-shaped valley created by glaciers during the Ice Age. It climbs through the Highline section of the route, the steepest portion of the trip. Just below the tracks, a huge tent city existed during the gold rush days. It was the final resting point before stampeders made the push to the summit.
Oh my goodness, look at that.
The White Pass Railroad is one of the steepest narrow-gauge railroads in America. Narrow-gauge tracks are only 3 feet apart compared to 4 feet 8 inches for standard-gauge track. Narrow-gauge tracks were used because they required less construction space on the sheer ledges and because they were better at negotiating the tighter curves of the mountain terrain.
Well, you're going to want to have your cameras ready because we're coming up to one of the most spectacular portions of our trip. In just a moment, we're going to cross over Glacier Gorge. This is one of the best places on the trip to photograph the train going around the curve, over that wooden trestle 1,000 feet above the valley floor. And then we're going to enter into the first of our 2 tunnels. But those of you a little wary of heights might not want to be peering off the left as we cross over Glacier Gorge. It's just going to look like we're virtually floating 1,000 feet above the valley.
on this wooden trestle constructed back in 1898. And remarkably enough, both the tunnel and the wooden trestle were constructed during the harshest winter months of 1898. This tunnel's around 600 feet long and it's very dark inside, so be prepared for the darkness.
Just after leaving the tunnel, the train passes the appropriately named Inspiration Point. Passengers look back to get a last glimpse of Skagway, which is now 17 miles behind them. What happened 100 years ago in the valley just below these tracks is in sharp contrast to the magnificent scenery.
The White Pass became known as the Dead Horse Trail because of the thousands or so horses that died along the trail. We estimate around 3,000 or more. They used the horses, they abused the horses, they took the horses up the narrow trail and overloaded them. If they were injured, they just continued to use them until they no longer get use out of them. Some of the stampeders, the old-timers, talk about these horses actually committing suicide, just walking off the hillside and falling to their deaths because they're just so overloaded.
As the train nears the summit, the tracks and the original Trail of 98 merge once again. Here, the White Pass Trail is a narrow, rocky path, worn down by thousands of stampeders and pack animals. On a foggy Alaskan morning, it is not difficult to imagine the hardships endured by those seeking their fortune in the gold fields to the north.
Because everybody is carrying, a ton of goods, a year's supply of food, that takes a lot of effort to move over the trail. It took them 3 months, maybe 4 months or so. They would take, 100 pounds on their back. They would move it up 4 or 5 miles, drop it off, and come back again. And they keep on going back and forth until they had moved their entire supply up to that point 3 or 4 miles down the trail. And then they did it all over again. And they kept on doing that until they eventually got to the other side.
When the railroad reached the White Pass summit in 1899, stampeders could ride to the top of the rugged mountain in relative comfort. The horse trail was soon abandoned. Leaving behind the ghostly images evoked by the sight of the trail, passengers on the Gold Rush train are soon brought back to the present.
All right, so we're up here at the White Pass Summit. So in just a moment, we're going to cross over the border into British Columbia, Canada. If you're looking off the left side of the train, you'll see the Canadian flag and the United States flag, as well as a bronze obelisk that denotes the actual border, and then a sign which reads White Pass, elevation 2,888 feet. We have climbed that high from sea level over just 20.4 miles of track. So again, this is milepost 20.4 from your rail maps, the White Pass Summit.
The train ride to the summit takes about 90 minutes, a mere blink of an eye compared to the months of hardship endured by stampeders before the railway was completed. For most modern-day rail passengers, the White Pass summit is as far north as they travel. The railway uses a long siding at the summit to move engines from one end of the train to the other for the return trip to Skagway. Our Gold Rush rail adventure continues north through Canada's beautiful British Columbia province. For Gold Rush stampeders and modern-day tourists alike, the landscape above the White Pass summit reveals a delightful change from the earlier part of the route. Stampeders found this part of the journey easier going than the rugged mountain trail. The train emerges from the tight mountain pass into an open stretch of bedrock dotted with ponds and lakes. The crater-like terrain was created by the retreat of the last great glacier. Battered snow fences strewn along the tracks are remnants of unsuccessful attempts to control the harsh elements of the North Country.
I'd just like to thank you once again for riding with us today. I hope you enjoyed your trip over the White Pass Summit and on to Fraser. It was certainly my pleasure to share with you the history of the gold rush and of the area. It was pretty exciting for me as well, because my great-grandfather was an original Klondike Gold Rush stampeder. He crossed over the Chilkoot Trail back in 1898 in search for gold. Then he stayed in the area and started a family, and my grandfather actually worked for this railroad. He was a heavy equipment operator, clearing the tracks of snow. So when I crossed over the trail for the first time in 1998, it was pretty exciting because that made me a fourth-generation Klondike Gold Rush stampeder. I guess I crossed over the trail 100 years after my great-grandfather had made his trip into the country. So welcome to Fraser, British Columbia. Now, in just a moment, we'll be coming to a stop.
The old two-story water tank is all that remains to signify the importance of this stop along the White Pass and Yukon route. It is the last such structure remaining on the railroad. Today, Fraser is a major transfer point for passengers, some returning to Skagway and others heading on to Whitehorse by bus. For passengers continuing on to Bennett, this is a place to change trains.
Okay, folks, you can come over and transfer. Pick up the steps and we're ready to go.
Folks, welcome aboard the Lake Bennett Adventure rail bus excursion from Fraser down to Bennett.
John McDermott is a longtime conductor on the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad.
As we travel along here over the top of this plateau, we're going along the area that the White Pass Trail went as it crossed over the summit and went on down into Lake Bennett. The trail up here on top's not nearly as well defined as it was on the other side of the summit, because up here the miners could spread out across these ridge tops and go along the lakes. Along here on the top, though, it's kind of interesting to look at the geology of the area. It was very heavily glaciated back during the last ice age. The ice left some 10,000 years ago. You could see on the hills that they're quite rounded due to the erosion of the glaciers. But where we are right now on this level, you can see the little lakes and tarns, little pockets have been carved out by the base of the glacier, and ice sheet as it moved along here, heading up over the top of the pass down to Tidewater.
The trip from Fraser to Bennett is only 12 miles, but it takes nearly an hour, allowing plenty of time for passengers to soak up the stark beauty of this ever-changing landscape. At Log Cabin, the train crosses the Klondike Highway for the first time. During the gold rush, Log Cabin was an important stop on the White Pass Trail. The Canadian Mounted Police checked stampeders to be sure they had enough supplies to survive the rest of the trip. After leaving Log Cabin, the landscape changes again as the train enters a lush wilderness area with thick stands of pine. It was along this area of broad lakes and ample forests that stampeders stopped to build boats for the rest of the journey to the gold fields. Giant tent cities were built along the shores of Lake Lindeman and Lake Bennett to sustain the stampeders through the winter months.
Folks, we're just coming on down into Lake Bennett now. We'll stop the train right in front of the historic station. We're going to be here an hour and 50 minutes until we depart. We blow the whistle at 10 minutes to 1. We leave at 1 o'clock.
Surrounded by cloud-top mountains, Lake Bennett today is a serene setting. An image in sharp contrast to the wild times of the gold rush days.
From the spring of '98 through to the summer of '99, this area here would have been the main area of town because the goods would have
Rob Scoble is an interpreter at Lake Bennett for Parks Canada.
And the waterfront area on this side, up above us, between here and the pass, there were a series of little lakes. There would have been boats and barges working those lakes, and then pack trains sort of transporting goods in between. What we're going to be doing is moving out towards the edge of town. Well, Bennett is located at the end of the Chilkoot and the White Pass trails. So during the gold rush, this would have been a boat building center. The time when Bennett would have had its maximum sort of population would have been just before the ice went out in the spring of '98. And at that time, there were likely close to 20,000 people either in Bennett or in the area immediately surrounding it. When the ice finally did go out, about 7,000 boats headed off down Lake Bennett, bound for Dawson City.
Like so many things along the Gold Rush Trail, Bennett's role has changed dramatically since the hectic Gold Rush days. Today, many of the 3,000 hikers who come off the Chilkoot Trail each year spend their final night camping at Bennett.
I really think this is one of the nicest spots on the trail. I think the thing that really sets Bennett as a site apart from a number of the other locations along the trail is that the historic footprint of the old town is sort of used to define the campground. You can walk along the main street, which is the main pathway that goes through the campground, and you can see the piles of artifacts that are associated with the different businesses that would have been operated along. And so it's kind of neat because you can walk along and say, there's the bakery, there's the Lakeview Hotel, there's the Arctic Hotel, because those things are situated, you know, right where they were in the piles of artifacts that are there to define their location, even though none of the buildings are actually remaining, with the exception, of course, of the church. The Bennett Church is the only standing structure that dates back to the Gold Rush era that's left along the entire length of the trail, and it's become a little bit of a symbol of the Gold Rush because it is still standing, and the architecture of the church is actually quite interesting. The siding on the church is actually the quarter rounds that were sliced off the railway ties for the White Pass Railway.
Bennett is the ideal place to end this Gold Rush adventure, a quiet, peaceful setting where the sense of the Gold Rush is everywhere.
Some people, I think, do get a sense of the Gold Rush. I think it helps people hopefully engage their imagination a little bit, because I think that's, you know, ultimately what you have to do to understand the Gold Rush.
Once the railroad was completed to Whitehorse, Bennett became another gold rush ghost town. Today, the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad itself serves another purpose than it did 100 years ago at Bennett. In addition to bringing visitors to one of the most isolated gold rush areas, the train ferries hikers coming off the Chilkoot Trail back to civilization. Wisely, the railroad provides a separate car for those who've been on the trail for several days. For tourists and hikers alike, a trip back to Skagway on the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad is a time to reflect on the journey and the gold rush era.
It was a physical challenge. It was a grueling hike.
It was all the challenge that I had sort of expected it to be, and all the spectacular views and the unique feeling of history along the trail, of retracing the steps of the Stampeders. It was fantastic. Oh, this was the perfect way to end the hike, I found, taking the train. It's the big reward at the end of the hike. It's the treat, get taken back to your vehicle and back to reality this way. It was the best way to go.
It gives you a mental picture of what it might have been like, and of course when you look down and see some of the residue of some of the wrecks, like the rock that fell, the 100-ton granite rock, that gives you some perspective on some of the trials and tribulations they might have experienced.
I think from a history standpoint, most of us want to go back and read more now than we have. Also, there wasn't enough money to make us do what they did. But then that's the way all our early pioneers were, and even the pioneers today. It takes a certain rate of people to do that.
It's just really unbelievable, the hardships that some of these people must have gone through to get where they wanted to.
Every Saturday during the summer, the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad offers a special excursion that makes even a stronger connection to the days of '98.
Our day is special because we have the last operating steam locomotive built in the United States for a narrow gauge train. Engine 73 was built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1947. It was in service until 1963 when it was taken out of service and replaced by diesel engines. It was put on display up at Lake Bennett for many years and frankly forgotten. Early 1980s it was restored by our rail people and our shops people and then put into service. The steam engine actually is quite powerful and picks up speed very quickly. It takes a little time going up the hill, but it gives you a real thrill as you're going up. You can actually feel it work because it is like a live piece of machinery. On the days the steam engine runs, we get the real rail fan that comes out. People have come from all over the world to ride our train, and today when you, if you're on the train, you'll probably meet people from all over the United States. I think the steam engine coupled with the scenery usually brings a lot of oohs and ahs. People really feel that they've had a different experience from what our normal run would be.
Just past the Glacier Bridge, Engine 73 stops for a ritual right out of its past. Historically, steamers took on water at this location from a wooden water tower. Now, a hydraulic pump pulls water from the Skagway River to feed the steamer's needs. Skagway entertainer Steve Heitz brings alive the rich memories of Alaska's Gold Rush train.
Look to the north country, up where few men have been. Listen there in the virgin country, there's gold upon the wind. And the wind blows across the countryside, spreading the word both far and wide. There's riches here for the taking, the dreamers are awakened to the cry. Lift up my feet and I move on along, be by horse or by ship or by train. The golden hills at the end of the trail resound to the sound of my name.
The spectacular steam train journey along the Trail of 98 provides a dramatic exclamation point to this trip on board the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad, leaving all who take the trip with new perspectives on one of the most colorful episodes in American history.
One thing that's kind of interesting about my job is that I will meet the descendants of many of these individuals. People whose father and mother or great-grandfather, great-grandmother went on the Stampede. For them, the story comes down that it was this extraordinary adventure, and they tell that story. 100 years ago, Soapy Smith was walking these same streets. 100 years ago, the Stampeders were walking the same streets. They were lugging their ton of goods up the pass. Well, this is where it actually happened. Well, I think the Stampeder of today, the visitor of today, can get a little bit of that. Sometimes it takes a little digging, like walking over to Dai and looking at the ruins and the town site, or going up the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad and seeing the Trail of 98, the Dead Horse Trail, remnants of that. And it takes a little bit of imagination too to try to see that. But it's there, it's definitely there. It's ourselves, we sort of look at ourselves. Would we go on the gold rush? Would we be taken up by this mass stampede?